Imagine you're an archaeologist. You've spent years in dusty libraries, ancient ruins, crumbling temples. You've translated clay tablets in Iraq, studied bark scrolls in the Amazon, examined stone carvings in India. And everywhere you look, you keep finding the same story. A great flood, waters rising, humanity nearly wiped out, a few survivors who rebuild everything from scratch. At first, you think it's just coincidence. Similar stories happen, right? People live near water, floods happen, they remember the bad ones, but then you find it again and again. The Sumerians have it, the Babylonians, the Hebrews, the Greeks, the Hindus, the Chinese, the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Incas, indigenous tribes in Australia, island cultures in the Pacific, Native Americans from the Arctic to Patagonia. Over 200 distinct flood myths from cultures that never met each other, never traded, never even knew the other existed. That's not coincidence, that's something else entirely. So here's the paradox that's bothered scholars for centuries. Why do civilizations separated by oceans and millennia all remember a catastrophic deluge? How does a Bronze Age city-state in Mesopotamia tell essentially the same story as an oral tradition passed down by Aboriginal Australians for 10,000 years? What are the chances that humans on opposite sides of the planet independently invented identical myths about divine punishment, rising waters, and a handful of survivors tasked with repopulating the earth? Either something really happened, something so devastating that it burned itself into the collective memory of every human culture on earth, or there's something else going on. Something about human psychology, about how we process disaster, about why we need stories of destruction and rebirth. Maybe both. Tonight, we're going to explore one of humanity's deepest shared memories. We'll start in ancient Sumer, where the first written flood story was carved into clay almost 5,000 years ago. We'll follow the story through Babylon, through the Bible, across Asia and into the Americas. We'll look at the geological evidence, the theories about catastrophic sea level rises and melting ice sheets. We'll examine how oral traditions can preserve real events for thousands of years, and we'll dive into the psychological reasons why flood myths might resonate so deeply in human consciousness. And if you're interested in more prehistoric mysteries, there's a book exploring ancient secrets available at sleepytimehistory.com. Worth checking out if this kind of thing keeps you up at night, or in this case, helps you drift off. But this isn't about proving any single flood account is true or false. It's about understanding why this story, this specific narrative of water and destruction and survival, appears everywhere humans have ever told stories. Because whether it's literal history, cultural memory, or something written into our DNA, the Great Flood Paradox reveals something profound about who we are and what we remember. So let's go back to where the written record begins, to the cities of ancient Mesopotamia, where the flood story first appeared in human writing. The tablets were found in pieces, fragments really, broken clay scattered across the ruins of ancient Eridu, the oldest city in Sumer, maybe the oldest city anywhere. Archaeologists in the early 20th century dug them up from layers of earth that hadn't been disturbed for almost 4,000 years. The cuneiform writing was archaic, difficult to translate. But when scholars finally pieced together what remained of the text, they realized they were holding something extraordinary, the oldest written flood story in human history. They called it the Eridu Genesis, composed sometime around 2300 BCE, maybe earlier, and it tells the story of a man named Ziusudra, a pious king who receives a divine warning. The gods have decided to destroy humanity with a catastrophic flood, but one deity, Enki, the god of wisdom and water, takes pity on Ziusudra. He whispers instructions through the walls of the king's reed house. Build a boat, make it massive, seal it with pitch, load it with animals and seeds. The storm is coming. Sound familiar? It should, because this is the template, the original. Every flood story that comes after, from Gilgamesh to Noah to Manu in Hindu tradition, they all carry echoes of this Sumerian account. But here's what makes the Eridu Genesis so fascinating. It's not just a story about survival. It's a story about cosmic order, about the relationship between gods and humans, about the terrifying unpredictability of water in a place where water meant everything. Ancient Sumer was built on contradiction. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, what we now call southern Iraq, was possibly the most fertile place on earth. Rich alluvial soil deposited by annual flooding, abundant fish and waterfowl, wild grains that could be cultivated into the first systematic agriculture. This is where civilization as we understand it began. The first cities, the first writing, the first organized religion, the first codified laws, all of it emerged from these floodplains. But that fertility came at a price. The rivers were violent and unpredictable. Unlike the Nile, which flooded on a reliable schedule every year, the Tigris and Euphrates were chaotic. Some years they barely rose at all, leaving crops to wither and populations to starve. Other years they surged over their banks without warning, drowning entire settlements, washing away granaries and temples and everything humans had built. You could go to sleep in a thriving city and wake up underwater. This wasn't theoretical. Archaeological evidence shows that ancient Sumerian cities were repeatedly destroyed by catastrophic floods. Ur, Uruk, Kish, Shuruppak. All of them show layers of water-deposited sediment several feet thick, marking disasters that must have killed thousands. Some of these flood layers date to around 2900 BCE, right when the flood stories would have been entering oral tradition before being written down centuries later. So the Sumerians lived with this constant tension. Water was their greatest blessing and their most terrifying threat. Their gods reflected this duality. Enki was both the wise provider who taught humans irrigation and agriculture, and the unpredictable force who could drown the world on a whim. Enlil, the storm god, brought both life-giving rain and devastating floods. The cosmos itself was imagined as emerging from primordial waters, and water remained the substance through which divine will manifested most powerfully. In Sumerian cosmology, floods weren't random disasters. They were resets, divine corrections. When humanity became too numerous, too noisy, too corrupted, the gods would wipe the slate clean and start over. This idea, this concept of cyclical destruction and renewal, would echo through every subsequent flood tradition. The waters rise not as punishment exactly, but as purification, a return to the primordial state from which new order could emerge. The Eridu Genesis tablets describe the flood itself in fragmented but vivid language. 7 days and 7 nights of storms, waters rising until they covered the mountains. All of humanity drowned except Zusudra in his boat. When the waters finally receded, he made offerings to the gods, and in gratitude for his piety, they granted him immortality and made him a deity himself. He didn't just survive the apocalypse. He transcended it, became something more than human through his endurance, but most of the tablet is lost. What survives is maybe a third of the original text. Scholars have spent decades trying to reconstruct the missing portions, comparing it with later versions, filling in gaps with educated guesses. We'll probably never know the complete story as the Sumerians told it. What remains are fragments, pieces of something larger, hints of a narrative that once made perfect sense to people living in mud-brick cities, watching the rivers with a mixture of reverence and dread. Walking through reconstructed Sumerian cities today, or what's left of them, you can feel that tension still. The ruins sit on mounds, tells, built up from thousands of years of occupation and destruction and rebuilding. And underneath, in the oldest layers, there's often that sediment. that water-deposited clay marking the moments when everything drowned, when the cosmic order reset itself, when only the faithful survived to build again. The Sumerians were the first to write it down, but they weren't the last to tell it. The story was just beginning its journey through history. The Sumerians told the story first, but it was the Babylonians who made it immortal. By 1800 BCE, Sumer as a distinct civilization had largely disappeared, absorbed into the expanding Akkadian and later Babylonian empires. But the story survived. They were too important to forget, too deeply embedded in how people understood the world and their place in it. So scribes copied them, translated them, adapted them to new languages and new theological frameworks. The flood narrative became something larger, more elaborate, more psychologically complex. It became the story of Gilgamesh. Technically, it's not Gilgamesh's story. The flood narrative appears in Tablet 11 of the epic, told not by the hero himself but by Utnapishtim, the Babylonian version of Ziusudra. Gilgamesh has travelled to the ends of the earth seeking the secret of immortality, and he finds this ancient man living in a remote paradise, untouched by death or decay. How did you achieve this? Gilgamesh asks. How did you escape mortality? And Utnapishtim responds with the story of the flood. The parallels to the earlier Sumerian account are obvious. The gods decide to destroy humanity. One deity, Ea, essentially the same as Enki, warns Utnapishtim through the walls of his reed house. Build a boat, he says, but this time the instructions are extraordinarily specific. The boat should be 120 cubits high, 120 cubits wide, 120 cubits long. A perfect cube. 7 decks inside divided into 9 compartments, coated inside and out with pitch to make it watertight. Load it with the seed of all living things, your family, craftsmen to preserve human knowledge, animals of every kind. Utnapishtim obeys. And the text describes his preparations in remarkable detail. He gathers materials, recruits workers, slaughters animals to feed the labourers building the ark. There's an almost bureaucratic precision to it, as if the scribe wanted readers to understand this wasn't mythology but engineering. When the boat is finished, Utnapishtim loads everything aboard. Then he waits. The flood comes with a violence that seems to terrify even the gods. The storm god Adad roars in the clouds. Darkness covers the earth. The dikes of heaven break open. For 6 days and 6 nights the deluge continues. The text says the gods themselves cowered like dogs, pressed against the outer walls of heaven, frightened by what they had unleashed. Even the mother goddess Ishtar cries out in regret, lamenting that she agreed to destroy her children. On the 7th day, the waters calm. The boat has survived, carried on currents to a mountain called Nisir. Utnapishtim opens a window and looks out at a drowned world. Everything is silent. All of humanity has turned to clay. He weeps. Then he waits. After 7 more days he releases the dove. It circles, finds nowhere to land, returns. He releases a swallow. Same result. Finally he releases a raven. The raven flies away and doesn't come back. Land has emerged somewhere. It's safe to leave. Utnapishtim makes offerings to the gods. He builds an altar on the mountain top and sacrifices animals, and the gods smell the savour of the offering and gather around like flies, grateful and ashamed. They hadn't meant for it to be so total, so complete. The goddess Ishtar vows that she'll remember this day forever, holding up her necklace of lapis lazuli as a reminder, the same way a rainbow would later serve in the biblical account. Then Enlil arrives, furious that anyone survived. He had wanted complete extinction. But Ea defends Utnapishtim, arguing that instead of total destruction, the gods should use more measured punishments in the future, send wild animals or disease or famine, but not universal annihilation. Enlil relents, and in a moment of divine generosity, he grants Utnapishtim and his wife immortality. They become like gods, removed from the human world, living in this distant paradise where Gilgamesh eventually finds them thousands of years later. The flood survivor becomes the wise immortal, carrying knowledge from the world before into the world after. The Epic of Gilgamesh existed in various forms for over a millennium. Scribes copied it, edited it, added theological commentary. By the time Assyrian king Ashurbanipal assembled his great library at Nineveh, around 650 BCE, the version that included the flood narrative was considered the definitive text. It was stored among thousands of other tablets, a complete record of Mesopotamian literature and knowledge, waiting in darkness for someone to find it. That someone was George Smith, an English banknote engraver with no formal archaeological training but an obsessive fascination with cuneiform. He taught himself to read the ancient script by studying fragments in the British Museum, became so proficient that he was hired to help catalogue and translate the museum's growing collection of Mesopotamian tablets. In 1872, while examining pieces that had been excavated from Nineveh decades earlier, Smith found something that made his hands shake. Tablet 11 of the Gilgamesh epic, the flood story. And it was older than Genesis. Victorian England was not prepared for this revelation. Biblical literalism was still the dominant framework for understanding ancient history. Genesis was supposed to be the original divinely inspired account of human origins and early disasters. Now here was proof, written in clay, that the Hebrews had inherited their flood narrative from earlier Mesopotamian sources. The theological implications were staggering. Smith's translation caused such a sensation that the London Daily Telegraph actually funded an expedition to Iraq to search for more tablets, more pieces of the story. The story kept getting older. In the early 20th century, scholars translated another Mesopotamian text called the Atrahasis Epic, composed around 1700 BCE. It contained yet another version of the flood narrative, this time with an additional detail that explained the divine motivation more completely. Humanity had become too numerous, too noisy. The constant racket of human civilization disturbed the gods, kept them awake, frayed their patience, so they decided to eliminate the noise permanently through flood. Only Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise, was warned by Enki and survived to repopulate a quieter world. What these various Mesopotamian versions reveal is something crucial about how ancient people understood mythology. These weren't rigid, unchanging stories handed down from the gods. They were living documents, constantly evolving, being adapted to new political and theological contexts. The Sumerians told one version, the Akkadians modified it, the Babylonians elaborated it further. Each culture added details, changed names, adjusted motivations to fit their understanding of divine justice and cosmic order. The core remained consistent, a catastrophic flood, one righteous man saved, animals preserved, humanity given a second chance, but the specifics shifted generation by generation, and yet certain details stayed remarkably stable across all versions. The massive boat, the pitch coating, the specific dimensions, the loading of animals, the releasing of birds to test whether land had emerged, the mountain landing, the sacrifice afterward, the divine reward. These motifs persisted because they had power, because they resonated with something deep in human psychology, our terror of drowning, our awe at survival, our need to believe that catastrophe serves some larger purpose. The Babylonians didn't invent the flood story, but they refined it, gave it psychological depth and narrative sophistication that would allow it to travel far beyond Mesopotamia. When Hebrew scribes centuries later composed their own version, they were working from this Babylonian template, adapting it to monotheistic theology, changing the moral framework but keeping the essential structure intact. The arc dimensions in Genesis are different from those in Gilgamesh, but not that different. The releasing of birds happens in the same sequence. The rainbow serves the same function as Ishtar's necklace. The inheritance is unmistakable. In the quiet halls of museums now you can see the actual tablets, the clay that survived when everything else crumbled, the cuneiform still sharp after 4,000 years. And if you look close enough you can still read Utnapishtim's words to Gilgamesh, explaining what it was like to watch the world drown, to float alone on infinite waters, to step out onto empty land and know you're responsible for whatever comes next. The story preserved in the only medium that could survive its own narrative, clay and water, destruction and endurance, written into the same substance from which, the Mesopotamians believed, the gods had originally shaped humanity. The Hebrew scribes who composed Genesis weren't trying to hide their sources, they were transforming them. Sometime around the 6th century BCE, possibly during the Babylonian exile when Jewish scholars lived in direct contact with Mesopotamian culture, the flood narrative was written down in what would become the opening chapters of the Torah. By this point the story had circulated orally for generations, already adapted to monotheistic theology, already stripped of its polytheistic framework. But the Mesopotamian skeleton was still there, unmistakable to anyone who knew both traditions. The ark, the animals, the birds, the landing on a mountain, the sacrifice, the divine promise never to destroy the world by flood again. What changed was everything that mattered. In the Mesopotamian versions, the gods are petty, impulsive, driven by irritation and regret. They destroy humanity because we're too loud, then immediately wish they hadn't. They cower in fear of their own storm, gather around sacrifices like hungry beggars. They're powerful but not particularly wise, capable of cosmic destruction but incapable of cosmic justice. The flood happens because of divine caprice, nothing more. No moral calculation, no judgment of human behavior. Just noise abatement taken to its logical extreme. Genesis takes that same narrative and inverts the entire theological structure. Now there's only one God, and he doesn't act on impulse. The flood comes because the earth has become corrupt, filled with violence. Humanity hasn't just been annoying. Humanity has fundamentally broken the moral order of creation. God looks at what people have become and experiences something the Mesopotamian gods never quite managed: genuine sorrow. The text says his heart was grieved. This isn't irritation. This is profound disappointment at a failed experiment, the kind of sadness that comes from watching something you created with love turn monstrous. Noah survives not because a mischievous deity decided to save him on a whim, but because he's righteous. The text is explicit about this. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. He walked with God. The flood isn't arbitrary punishment. It's the logical consequence of systemic moral collapse, with a single exception saved to preserve the possibility of renewal. Same story, completely different universe of meaning. The instructions Noah receives are similarly specific to the Mesopotamian accounts. 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. 3 decks, a door in the side, a window near the top, rooms inside coated with pitch. Take your wife, your sons' wives, 2 of every living creature, male and female, enough food for everyone. The engineering precision matches Utnapishtim's instructions almost exactly, suggesting the Hebrew scribes were working from written sources, not just oral tradition. But here's where things get interesting. If you read the Genesis flood narrative carefully, you start noticing inconsistencies. How many animals did Noah take? Chapter 6 says 2 of each kind. Chapter 7 says 7 pairs of clean animals, 1 pair of unclean. How long did the flood last? Some verses suggest 40 days. Others imply over a year. These aren't errors. They're evidence of something scholars have argued about for centuries. The documentary hypothesis proposes that Genesis, like much of the Torah, was composed from multiple source documents woven together by later editors. Two main sources appear in the flood narrative. The earlier one, called J for its use of the divine name Yahweh, tells a simpler story. 40 days of rain, 7 pairs of clean animals, a relatively brief catastrophe. The later source, called P for its priestly concerns and formal style, describes a cosmic undoing of creation itself. The fountains of the deep burst open, the windows of heaven opened. Water returns the world to the primordial chaos that existed before God separated the waters in the first chapter of Genesis. This version lasts over a year. It's not just a storm, it's decreation, the world being unmade completely before being carefully reconstructed. Both versions were considered too important to discard, so the final editors interwove them, creating a flood narrative with 2 slightly different timelines and animal counts running in parallel. Modern readers see contradiction. Ancient readers would have recognized completeness. 2 witnesses to the same event, 2 ways of understanding what it meant. The J source emphasizes divine-human relationship, God's personal grief and relief. The P source emphasizes cosmic order, the careful structure of creation being dissolved and then methodically restored. Together they create a flood story with theological depth that the Mesopotamian versions never quite achieved. The bird sequence preserves the Babylonian order exactly. First a raven, which flies back and forth, then a dove, which returns because it finds nowhere to land, then the dove again, and this time it comes back with an olive leaf, then the dove a third time, and it doesn't return. The waters have receded. Life has returned to the earth. Noah and his family can emerge onto dry ground and begin again. What happens next separates Genesis definitively from its sources. God makes a covenant, not just with Noah, not just with humanity, but with every living creature. Never again will a flood destroy all life. The rainbow becomes the sign of this promise, God's reminder to himself of his commitment to preserve creation despite humanity's persistent corruption. It's the same function as Ishtar's lapis necklace, but transformed into something universal and eternal, a covenant that applies to all future generations, all future species, regardless of their behavior. This story became the flood narrative for Western civilization, not because it was first, but because it was adopted by 3 related religious traditions that would eventually dominate much of the world. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all trace their lineage back to Abraham, and all 3 preserve the flood story as foundational to understanding divine justice and human fallibility. The Islamic tradition maintains the core narrative but adds specific details that distinguish it from the biblical account. In the Quran, Nuh preaches to his people for 950 years before the flood, warning them repeatedly to abandon their idolatry. They mock him. They refuse to listen. One of his sons refuses to board the ark, trusting that he can survive by climbing a mountain. He drowns. Nuh calls out to God, asking why his son wasn't saved, and God responds that the son wasn't truly part of his family, because righteousness, not blood, determines kinship. It's a theological refinement that emphasizes individual moral choice over inherited blessing. All 3 Abrahamic traditions agree on the essential point. The flood happened. One family survived. Humanity received a second chance. How we use that chance remains an open question, answered differently by each generation, each culture, each person who hears the story and wonders what they would have done, watching the waters rise, listening for the dove that might not return. But if the Mesopotamian and biblical stories were the only ones, the flood paradox wouldn't really be a paradox. It would just be cultural diffusion. A powerful myth born in one fertile river valley, carried along trade routes, translated and transformed as it spread. The problem is Asia, because thousands of miles away, in landscapes most Mesopotamians never even imagined. Other peoples were telling their own stories of a world-drowning flood, stories with no obvious path of transmission, stories that rhyme with the ones from the Tigris and Euphrates, but don't quite match, like independent witnesses describing the same crime scene from different angles. One of the most famous comes from China. Long before the historical dynasties, Chinese tradition tells of an age when the world was not just wet but broken. The sky had tilted. The rivers had gone mad. Water roared over the land without restraint, drowning fields, swallowing villages, turning the central plain into a vast, churning inland sea. At first, the gods chose a man named Gun to fix it. Gun's solution was simple: build walls, pile up earth, contain the water with dams and dikes. For 9 years he laboured, and for 9 years the floods laughed at him. In some versions, his failure is so catastrophic that he's executed by the celestial authorities. In others, he steals divine soil to build his embankments and is punished for his hubris. Either way, the message is clear. You can't just push water back and hope it stays. Then comes his son, Yu. Yu takes a different approach. Instead of blocking the flood, he studies it. He walks the drowned land, tracing the tangled paths of rivers and tributaries. He listens to elders, observes currents, measures depths. He realizes the problem isn't too much water. It's nowhere for the water to go. So Yu doesn't build a big wall. He carves channels. He cuts new riverbeds, dredges old ones, opens pathways from mountain valleys to lowland plains and finally to the sea. He works so tirelessly that, according to legend, he passes by his own house 3 times in 13 years and never steps inside. His wife gives birth. His child grows up. Yu keeps walking, mapping, digging, directing the water back into ordered paths. Eventually it works. The floods subside. The land dries. Agriculture becomes reliable. Human life can settle instead of scatter. For this achievement, Yu is granted the mandate of heaven and becomes the founder of the Xia dynasty, the first dynasty in traditional Chinese history. In other words, Chinese civilization begins when someone learns to tame the flood. For a long time, historians treated the Yu story the way they treated many early dynastic legends. Interesting, meaningful, but probably not historical. A mythological charter explaining why central authority over water management was sacred in early China. A political story about why rulers should be like Yu, tireless, self-sacrificing, in harmony with the rhythms of nature. Then, in 2016, a team of Chinese and American researchers published something curious. Studying sediments along the Yellow River near the Jishi Gorge, they found evidence of a truly massive flood around 1920 BCE. Not just a bad flood season, a catastrophic outburst triggered, they argue, by the collapse of a landslide dam. When that natural dam finally gave way, an enormous volume of water rushed downstream, potentially transforming the Yellow River basin for years. Their dating lines up intriguingly, with some archaeological proposals for the early Xia period. The scale of the flood, at least in their reconstruction, matches the kind of landscape-level disaster preserved in the Gunyu myth. Not a local village washed away, but an entire region reconfigured. Not everyone agrees with this interpretation. Some geologists question the extent of the flood. Some historians caution against tying a single event too neatly to a myth that likely absorbed centuries of memory and exaggeration. But even the possibility is suggestive. A real Yellow River megaflood, happening roughly when Chinese tradition places its great flood, woven over generations into a story of divine mandate and hydraulic engineering. Far to the southwest, under different stars, another flood hero is learning how to steer through catastrophe. In the Indian tradition, his name is Manu. One day, according to the Shatapatha Brahmana, Manu is performing his rituals, pouring water into his hands, when he notices a tiny fish begging him for protection. "Do not throw me back into the water," the fish says. "If you spare me now, I will save you in the future." Manu hesitates, then keeps the fish. As time passes, the fish grows, first too large for the jar, then too large for the tank, then too large for the river. Manu keeps moving it to bigger and bigger bodies of water until finally he releases it into the ocean. By now he understands, this is no ordinary fish. It is an avatar of Vishnu, the preserver god, manifesting as Matsya, the fish. The divine fish warns Manu of what's coming, a flood that will wash away everything. "Build a boat," Matsya says. "Take the 7 sages. Take the seeds of all living things. When the waters rise, I will return. Tie your vessel to my horn, and I will guide you through the darkness." The flood comes. Manu boards his boat, boards. The fish returns, colossal now, towing the fragile craft across a drowned world. In some versions, the mountain where the boat finally comes to rest is named. In others, the focus is on what happens after. Manu performing a ritual from which a woman emerges, with whom he repopulates the earth. Humanity is reborn, not just physically, but ritually, through sacrifice and divine grace. The earliest version of this story, in the Shatapatha Brahmana, is relatively spare. A talking fish, a warning, a boat, a mountain. Over centuries, as the story moves into the Puranas, it blossoms, the cast expands, the theological framing becomes explicit. Matsya is clearly identified as Vishnu. The 7 sages gain names and personalities. The cargo of the boat becomes more symbolic, not just seeds, but the Vedas themselves, the very knowledge needed to reconstruct order after cosmic dissolution. We can watch the myth evolve as Indian religious thought evolves, layering philosophical meaning over what might have begun as a simple memory of a local flood, or perhaps, some have suggested, as an echo of real river catastrophes in the Ganges basin during the late Vedic period. Again, certainty is impossible, but the pattern is familiar. A vast flood, a chosen survivor, a vessel, preserved life, a mountain, a new beginning. And still, Asia isn't finished with the water. Move further east and south, into the hills of mainland Southeast Asia and the islands off the Chinese coast, and you hear other voices, softer, but saying something similar. Among the Hmong, highland farmers whose traditional homelands stretch across the mountains of southern China, Laos, and Vietnam, there are tales of a flood that drowns almost everyone. In some versions, a brother and sister survive in a drum, or inside a gourd, floating for days or weeks before emerging onto an altered landscape. They become, reluctantly or accidentally, the ancestors of the next generation. The Shan people living along river valleys in Myanmar and Thailand tell stories of a time when the waters rose so high that only the tops of the highest hills remained. People survived on rafts, or in hollowed logs, or by clinging to trees until the flood receded. Sometimes the cause is moral. Humans angered the spirits. Sometimes it is simply the way of the world, cycles of destruction and renewal. Across the Taiwan Strait, indigenous Austronesian-speaking groups remember something even stranger. Communities like the Atayal and Paiwan preserve myths of the sea itself invading the land, rising up to swallow plains that had once been dry. People flee uphill. Sacred objects are lost under the waves. In some tellings, the survivors look down from new mountain homes at a coastline forever changed. What makes these stories remarkable is not just their content, but their geography. Many of these groups are not seafaring empires recording the experience of sailors, but farmers and hill people, often landlocked for most of their remembered history, still telling stories about oceans marching inland, about shorelines moving, about land that used to be there and isn't anymore. Some anthropologists have suggested that these might be cultural memories of post-Ice Age sea level rise, transmitted in fragments across thousands of years, or of more recent tsunamis and storm surges. Others see them as archetypal stories born from life lived in monsoon climates, where water can transform a landscape overnight. The truth may be a braid of both, particular disasters anchoring a general sense that the world is never as solid as it looks. What they are not, as far as we can tell, are borrowings from Mesopotamian or biblical traditions. The timeline doesn't really work. The details don't line up neatly. The theological frameworks are different. The Mong drum, the Matsya avatar, use channels through the Yellow River Los. They belong to their own worlds, their own languages, their own sacred geographies. And yet, here they are. A bureaucrat engineer in ancient China, walking waist-deep through floodwater. A Vedic ritualist cupping a tiny fish in his hands. A Hmong sibling pair sealed inside a drum. A Taiwanese elder pointing to a distant horizon and saying, "Once, the land went farther." Separate cultures, separate histories, separate cosmologies, all remembering that at some point the water came and it did not care who you were. The more of these independent traditions we encounter, Chinese, Indian, Southeast Asian, island Austronesian, the stranger the pattern becomes. Either the memory of a flood is one of the most contagious stories humans have ever told, spreading invisibly across continents for millennia, or, scattered across Eurasia, different communities kept going through the same kind of experience, their world drowning, their survival hanging on a boat, a mountain, a single family, a single act of warning or ingenuity. Either way, the paradox deepens. Because Asia is only half the globe, and the flood stories do not stop at its shores. Now we cross another ocean, because if the flood were only an old world memory, Mesopotamia, the Bible, India, China, the Hmong, the islanders of Taiwan, you could still try to save the simple explanation. Trade routes, missionaries, Silk Road storytellers passing tales along with spices and silk and disease. The Americas make that explanation much harder. For tens of thousands of years, the peoples of North and South America developed in isolation from Eurasia and Africa. Different crops, different animals, different writing systems, different gods. When Europeans finally arrived, they were stunned by the sheer otherness of American civilizations, and yet, almost as soon as they began listening, they started hearing something strangely familiar. In central Mexico, the Aztecs had a way of understanding time that makes everything feel precarious. They didn't imagine one single creation followed by history. They imagined a sequence of worlds called suns. Each sun was an age of the cosmos, with its own rules, its own inhabitants, and its own ending. According to the version recorded after the conquest, there had been 4 suns before the present one, 4 worlds, each destroyed in a different way, one by jaguars, one by wind, one by fire, and one called a Tonatiuh by water. In this watery sun, the story goes, the sky darkened, the rain did not just fall but devour. It poured without end. The earth drowned. Humans were not just killed, they were transformed into fish, into sea creatures, into beings that belonged to the new flooded world. It wasn't simply a bad storm, it was a complete reset. A cosmic rage washed away, making room for the next. The Maya, in the forests to the south and east, preserved their own vision of failed worlds in a text we now call the Popol Vuh. In it, the gods attempt to make humans who can remember and praise them. Their first efforts go wrong. Mud people collapse. Wooden people can walk and talk, but they have no hearts, no gratitude. The gods get angry. They send a great flood, not just of water, but of resins and strange substances to wipe the wooden people away. Animals attack them. Their grinding stones and cooking pots turn on them. The world itself rebels. The flood here is not just punishment, it's quality control. A failed version of humanity is cleared off the stage so that a better one, made from maize dough, can appear. Different pantheons, different calendars, different landscapes, still the same idea. Entire ages ending in water and life beginning again on the other side. Follow the spine of the Americas south into the Andes and you meet another figure watching the waters rise. In the Inca tradition, there is a creator god named Viracocha. Long before the historical empire, in the age when the world was still being arranged, Viracocha is said to have formed a race of giants. They displeased him, sometimes through disobedience, sometimes simply by existing in a world not yet ready. So he sent a flood. The giants were destroyed. The world was cleansed. Viracocha then reshaped the land and created new humans travelling from lake to lake, valley to valley, bringing culture and order. In some versions he emerges from Lake Titicaca itself, stepping into a landscape still marked by the traces of catastrophe. Farther south, in what is now Chile, the Mapuche people tell a story that sounds less like a moral lesson and more like a natural disaster narrated in mythic language. Two powerful serpents, Trentren Vilu and Kai Kai Vilu, go to war. Kai Kai is the lord of the waters. In his rage he raises the sea, sending it surging over the land, swallowing villages and forests, turning valleys into bays. Trentren, spirit of the earth, fights back. He lifts up hills and mountains, giving people places to flee. Those who reach the highest peaks survive. Those who do not become marine creatures or vanish under the waves. When the battle quiets, the landscape is transformed. Islands dot a ragged coastline. New channels and inlets cut into what used to be plains. To live in the Chiloé archipelago today is to inhabit the body of that myth. Drowned valleys, steep refuge hills, reminders that land and sea are not fixed boundaries but combatants that sometimes trade places. Move north again, but this time along the interior of the continent, and you find flood stories in communities who have never seen an ocean, but who know that water can still erase a world. Among the Hopi of the American Southwest, there are emergent stories that speak of multiple previous worlds, each destroyed for spiritual imbalance. In one, the people are warned that a flood is coming. They climb into hollow reeds, or into an opening provided by the Spider-Woman, and emerge in a new land after the waters recede. The flood is less about meteorology than about morality and transformation. A wet, overwhelming doorway from one age of being to the next. In the Great Lakes region, Ojibwe and other Anishinaabe-speaking peoples tell of a deluge that covers the earth. A cultural hero, often called Nanabojo, survives by clinging to a great raft with various animals. As the waters refuse to subside, they realize they need a bit of earth to remake the world, so they send divers down. One after another, animals plunge into the depths, the loon, the otter, the beaver. They return exhausted, or not at all. Finally, the muskrat volunteers, small and unassuming. He disappears below the surface for a long time. When his lifeless body floats back up, his paws are clenched. Inside them is a tiny bit of mud. From that scrap of earth placed on the back of a turtle, the new land grows. This is what scholars call an earth diver myth. The flood is total. The old world is gone. Creation begins again from the bottom, literally, with a small, stubborn act of retrieval. Caddoan-speaking peoples farther south, along the plains and river systems of what is now Texas and Oklahoma, preserve similar patterns. A world drowned. A few survivors on a raft or a high place. An animal plunging into the deep to bring up the materials from which this version of the earth will be built. Different names, different animals, different ritual details, the same basic blueprint: destruction, descent, and slow recreation. And then, If you turn away from the Americas and sail out into the blue, the pattern keeps following. Across Australia, Aboriginal groups whose ancestors have watched the coastline shift for tens of thousands of years maintain stories they call dreaming tracks, narratives tied to specific features of the land and sea. In several coastal traditions, elders speak of a time when the shore lay much farther out, when what is now seabed was dry country with campsites and sacred places. Then the waters rose. The sea moved inland, swallowing hunting grounds, covering ancestral paths. People retreated to higher ground. The names of the drowned places are sometimes still recited, like a list of the disappeared. On the islands scattered across the Pacific, from Polynesia to Micronesia, there are legends of lands that sank beneath the waves. In some cases, these are moral tales, a proud or impious people and a god who sends the ocean to claim them. In others, they feel eerily like the memory of real events, low-lying atolls overtopped by storms, volcanic flanks collapsing into the sea, coasts reshaped by tsunamis. There are Polynesian stories of great navigators who know of islands that no longer exist, of reef tops that were once villages, of ancestors forced to sail away when the sea took their homes. In a culture where genealogy and geography are memorized with astonishing precision, a vanished island is not just scenery, it's a wound in the map. When you step back and look at all this together, the similarities are tempting to flatten. Every culture has a flood myth, people sometimes say, as if that were enough. But if you listen closely, they are not the same myth. The Aztec Atonatiu is about cosmic cycles. The Maya flood in the Popol Vuh is about failed prototypes of humanity. Viracocha's deluge is about a creator revising his work. The Mapuche serpents are about the raw violence of earth processes. The Hopi floods usher in new worlds. The Anishinaabe raft and muskrat are about humility and cooperation. The Australian and Polynesian accounts often read like long-term coastal observation, stitched to cosmology. Different causes, different gods, different morals, different imagery. What they share is a skeleton. Overwhelming water, near total loss, a small remnant that survives by ingenuity, warning or grace, and a world made new when the waters finally go down. This brings up an uncomfortable question. Could some of these stories in the Americas and the Pacific have been coloured, or even planted, by contact with Europeans and their Bible? Missionaries certainly tried. They translated Genesis. They preached Noah from the pulpit and the mission school. Some later tellings of Native American stories do show signs of Christian framing, especially when recorded by clergy with a point to prove. But when anthropologists and linguists track the oldest versions they can find, stories told in indigenous languages with native cosmologies and characters, they often discover that the flood is already there, long before contact. The earth diver pattern in North America, for instance, shows up so widely, and with such consistent internal logic, that many scholars see it as a deep, pre-contact narrative layer. The Aztec Five Suns cosmology was recorded in pictorial codices and oral recitations tied to pre-conquest rituals. The Popol Vuh, though written down using Latin letters after the Spanish arrived, clearly preserves older mythic structures from a time when European ships were still unheard of in those forests. In Australia and the Pacific too, flood and sea rise stories abound into dreaming tracks and navigational chants, whose roots likely sink far deeper than a few centuries, so we are left with this. Peoples who had no contact with Mesopotamia, no knowledge of Genesis, no roads or ships linking them to the Yellow River or the Ganges, still telling each other, in the dark around their own fires, that once, long ago, the water rose and the world almost ended. Not in the same way, not for the same reasons, not with the same gods, but enough alike that, when you put them side by side, it feels less like a single story spreading and more like a recurring memory, surfacing again and again wherever humans live close enough to rivers, coasts, and storms to know how fragile dry land can be. At this point, the paradox is hard to ignore. Either water is such an obvious universal danger that humans everywhere independently invented flood cataclysms as their favourite metaphor for crisis, or scattered across the planet generation after generation, communities kept going through floods so large, so terrifying, that they refused to let the memory die. To go any further, though, we have to leave myth for a moment and look at the rocks themselves, the shorelines and sediments, the scars that real water leaves behind when it tears through a landscape. The first place many researchers look is a quiet inland sea that isn't, strictly speaking, a sea at all, the Black Sea. In the late 1990s, two oceanographers, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, proposed a story that sounded suspiciously like a scientific version of a deluge myth. Around 5,600 BCE, they argued, the world's Ice Age hangover was still playing out. Glaciers had melted. The Mediterranean was swollen, its surface higher than it had been for tens of thousands of years. To the north, beyond the narrow throat of the Bosporus, lay a large freshwater lake sitting in a deep basin, the ancestral Black Sea. Its surface, they suggested, was far lower than the Mediterranean's. For a while, a natural dam of rock and sediment kept the two apart. Then, one day, or over a few days, depending on how you imagine it, that dam failed. Salt water from the Mediterranean began to pour through the Bosporus into the Black Sea basin, roaring over the lip like a waterfall hundreds of times more powerful than Niagara, chewing away the channel, deepening it, widening it, accelerating the flow. The lake rose, drowning its shores. Rivers that had once flowed gently into it suddenly found their lower valleys filling from the wrong direction. Farmland vanished. Villages that had been safely inland were turned, in geological terms, into shallow seabed almost overnight. Ryan and Pittman called this event a Noah's flood. It was a deliberate provocation. They suggested that farming communities along that drowned shoreline might have fled in all directions, carrying with them a memory of a time when the sea had risen with impossible speed and eaten their world. It's an evocative picture. People waking to the distant roar of water, watching their fields become bays, their roads become channels, their sacred sites vanish beneath an alien salty tide. But geology is a slow, skeptical listener. As more cores were drilled and more sediment layers examined, other scientists began to push back. Yes, they agreed, the Black Sea did flood. Yes, it shifted from fresher to more marine water. Yes, the Bosporus opened. But the timing, the rate, and the violence of the event are still debated. Some studies suggest that the rise was spread out over centuries rather than a single cataclysmic year, more like a staircase than a cliff. The waterfall may have been powerful, but perhaps not apocalyptic. The shoreline would still have crept steadily inland. Fields would still have been lost, villages abandoned. But the drama might have been less like a sudden scream and more like a slow, relentless pressure. Season after season, generation after generation. Other researchers argue that the Black Sea might already have been partly salty before the supposed deluge, complicating the simple before and after picture. The neat story of a tranquil lake becoming a raging sea in a single moment of failure dissolves into something messier, more gradual, harder to tie to any one myth. Still, the basic point remains. This was not a stable world. The boundary between land and water in the early Holocene, the period after the last ice age, was breathing in and out, erasing coastlines that had stood for millennia. And the Black Sea was not alone. Between about 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, as the great continental ice sheets retreated, global sea level rose by more than 100 meters. It's a number so large it's hard to feel. Imagine the entire modern coastline redraw itself, not once but many times in slow motion. Imagine whole coastal plains that are now continental shelves. Imagine river valleys turned into estuaries, estuaries into bays, bays into open sea. To people living then, long before satellites or maps, it would not have looked like a single global event. It would have looked intensely local. The familiar fishing grounds are a little farther offshore each generation. The low-lying campsite where your grandparents once gathered clams is now a shallow reef. The sacred hill that once stood proudly above the plain is now an island ringed with waves. We can name some of these vanished lands. To the north of Europe, between what is now Britain and mainland Europe, there used to be a broad, fertile lowland with rivers, marshes and forests. Archaeologists call it Doggerland. For thousands of years, people hunted there, fished its rivers, and moved between what we now think of as separate islands and continents, without ever seeing open sea. As the ice melted, the North Sea poured in. Bit by bit, Doggerland shrank, becoming a patchwork of wetlands and lakes, then a scattering of islands, and finally just a memory written in sand and submerged peat. Today, trawlers still drag up bones of mammoths and elk, stone tools, even traces of ancient forests from its drowned floor. To live on its last remaining ridges must have felt like living on the roof of a house, as the water rises room by room. On the far side of Eurasia, in what we now call Southeast Asia, another great piece of real estate drowned, Sundaland. When sea levels were low, the shallow seas between present-day Thailand, Malaysia, Borneo, Java and Sumatra were dry land. Rivers branched across vast plains. People and animals walked from the Asian mainland deep into what is now an intricate maze of islands. As the seas rose, those plains were gradually consumed. Shorelines pulled inward. Valleys became straits. Hilltops became archipelagos. For communities whose lives were tied to specific places, springs, hills, caves, groves, the transformation must have been profound. The stories that Australian and Pacific Islander elders tell about land once extending far beyond today's coasts have close cousins here. Memories of lost hunting grounds and drowned paths, perhaps carried, perhaps reshaped across thousands of years. Closer to the cradle of many of our flood myths, another basin was filling the Persian Gulf. Today it is a shallow arm of the Indian Ocean, bracketed by Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. During the last glacial maximum, though, much of it was a broad river valley, watered by the Tigris, Euphrates and other streams, sprawling out into a fertile plain. Some researchers have suggested that this lowland may have been a refugium, an attractive region where people congregated as climates swung hot and cold. As sea level crept up, this riverine landscape was gradually submerged. The shoreline moved tens of kilometres inland. If you imagine of a string of settlements along those rivers, you can imagine too the strain of repeated relocation, the feeling that the sea itself was chasing you. It is not hard standing on the modern shore to picture an ancestor pointing out across the water and saying, "There, out there. That's where our people used to live before the flood." So we have rising seas, drowned valleys, lost lowlands. These are long, drawn-out floods measured in lifetimes and centuries, but the planet can do faster. In the northwestern United States, stretching across parts of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana, there is a landscape that looks like it belongs on another world. Deep, gouged channels, giant ripple marks, hundreds of meters across, erratic boulders perched where no glacier could have gently set them, dry waterfalls, their cliffs towering high above the present rivers. Geologists call this region the Channel Scablands. For a long time, nobody could quite explain their scale. Then, in the early 20th century, a geologist named J. Harlan Bretz proposed something outrageous at the time. This entire landscape had been carved not over millions of years by modest streams, but by massive, short-lived floods of almost unimaginable volume. The source, we now think, was Glacial Lake Missoula, a body of water held back by an ice dam in what is now Montana. When that dam failed, possibly many times, billions of tons of water were released in a matter of days. Walls of water hundreds of feet high thundered across the land at freeway speeds, stripping soil and rock, plucking boulders from their beds, reshaping valleys like soft clay. To anyone living nearby, this would not have been a slow encroachment. It would have been annihilation. Everything familiar, the hills, the river courses, the very shape of the horizon, would have been rewritten in a single deafening event. Then, after the roaring ended and the water finally settled into new channels, survivors would have stepped out into a world that looked wrong, as if some god had picked up the land and crumpled it. Events like the Missoula floods are rare, but they are real. They leave signatures that any passing geologist can read. Oversized ripples, scoured bedrock, giant bars of gravel that no ordinary river could carry. They prove that the Earth is capable of regional catastrophes on a scale that makes the biggest storm you've ever seen sound tame. Put all of this together, and a picture begins to form. Not of one neat, synchronized global flood that raised water over the highest mountains. There is no convincing geological trace of such a thing in the time frame of human existence. The rocks do not support the idea of a single, worldwide deluge wiping the slate clean in one moment of anger or mercy. Instead, there is something more complicated, and in some ways more haunting, a pattern. A world slowly warming after the last ice age, ice sheets collapsing, seas rising more than 100 meters, lowlands drowning, coasts marching inland lakes overtopping their basins, ice dams failing without warning, regional floods, some slow, some unbelievably fast, transforming landscapes and uprooting communities. Generation after generation, in different corners of the planet, people watched water behave in ways that felt, to them, almost supernatural. They ran from advancing shorelines. They abandoned valleys turning to marsh. They saw, or heard about, rivers reversing course, seas breaching barriers, walls of muddy water scouring everything they knew. No single event links all the stories, but the background is the same. A period when the boundary between wet and dry was unstable, when the flood was not a distant metaphor but a recurring possibility. From that world you might expect not one canonical flood myth, but a chorus of them. Local, specific, coloured by particular gods and moral lessons, but all tracing back in one way or another to the same physical reality. Water can rise, water can erase, and sometimes, in the span of a single human lifetime, it can do both on a scale large enough to make the end of the world feel less like a story and more like something your grandparents still whisper about when the rain falls hard at night. If the planet was doing all of this, if seas were creeping across plains and lakes were emptying in single violent breaths, the next question is almost unavoidable. How much of it did people actually remember? Not in the way we do now, with satellites and tide gauges and peer-reviewed papers, but in the way a grandparent remembers the winter the river froze solid, or the war that took your uncle, or the day the town burned. How long can a story like that truly last? For a long time, the quiet assumption in many academic circles was, not very. Oral traditions were treated as soft, blurry things, interesting as folklore, unreliable as history. A few hundred years, perhaps. Beyond that, it was thought the details would decay, shifting and smearing like wet ink. And then, in places far from Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean, something awkward began to emerge. Along the coasts of Australia, Aboriginal elders have long told stories about a different shoreline, about bays that used to be forests, about islands that were once hills on a continuous stretch of land, about places under the waves where people lived, hunted, held ceremonies. For generations, these were treated by outsiders as poetic exaggerations, as myth in the narrow dismissive sense. Then geologists and linguists started to pay closer attention. When you line those stories up with reconstructions of post-Ice Age sea level rise, something strange happens. The drowned landscapes described in the narratives often match the actual reconstructed coastlines from 7, 8, even 9,000 years ago. In some cases, the path of a spirit who crossed from that headland to that far hill follows almost exactly the ridge of a submerged land bridge that vanished when the ocean rose. Patrick Nunn, a geologist who has spent years working with indigenous communities in Australia and the Pacific, calls this kind of work geomythology, the attempt to extract geological events from mythic narratives and to see how far back cultural memory can really reach. He and others have catalogued dozens of such correspondences, stories of the sea eating the land that align with known episodes of rapid coastal flooding, accounts of rivers changing course that match ancient avulsions seen in the sediment, tales of islands splitting, mountains breaking, fire from the sky. Not every detail lines up neatly. Myths are not lab notebooks. They mix observation with meaning, event with interpretation. But the broad patterns are hard to ignore. In case after case, the narrative core seems to point at real physical events thousands of years in the past. This forces a re-evaluation of what an oral tradition can do. It helps to understand that not all telling stories works the way a late-night anecdote at a party does. Many traditional societies treat important accounts, especially those about origins, disasters, migrations, as sacred technology. They are not just entertainment, they are infrastructure. The mechanics of that infrastructure are surprisingly robust. Rhythm is one of them. A narrative set into a pattern of beats and pauses, or linked to a chant or song, is much harder to forget or casually alter. Like a poem you learned in childhood, it snaps into place or feels wrong immediately. Repetition is another. Foundational stories aren't told once in a while. They are recited at specific times in specific places over and over, sometimes with call and response participation. Corrections are public and immediate. If a line is skipped, someone notices. Then there is context. These stories are often bound to ritual. You don't just tell the flood story, you tell it at the first big rain, or at initiation, or when you cross a particular river. The landscape itself becomes a set of mnemonic hooks. Each headland, each rock, each bend in the river cues the next part of the narrative, and crucially, there are designated keepers. In many indigenous Australian groups, there are elders whose responsibility is to carry specific songlines or dreaming stories. In Polynesia, there were navigators and priests who learned long genealogies and voyage accounts word for word. Among the Vedic tradition in India, sacred texts were preserved orally for centuries with an accuracy that, when finally written down, stunned modern philologists. Training for this role can take decades. It involves not only memorizing the words, but learning the correct pronunciation, cadence, and occasions of use. A story is not something you own. It is something you are entrusted with. This is why the common telephone game analogy doesn't quite fit. In the children's game, the whole point is to introduce error. The whispers are casual, the stakes are zero, the participants change every round, and no one is allowed to correct the transmission. Degradation is baked in. In a formal oral tradition, the incentives point in the opposite direction. The transmission is public, the stakes are often sacred, the line of teachers is continuous, and listeners are empowered, sometimes obligated to correct deviations. The goal is not novelty, but fidelity. Under those conditions, a story can, at least in principle, remain remarkably stable over a long span of time. Details still shift, characters merge, moral lessons accumulate, but the skeleton of the event, the existence of a flood, a fire, an upheaval, can endure like a spine under changing flesh. There is another factor that makes some stories especially durable: catastrophe. Trauma does not just leave scars on individuals, it imprints itself on groups. Neurologically, events that involve strong emotion, terror, grief, awe, are encoded more deeply and recalled more vividly. Socially, such events demand explanation. They become reference points. Before the fire, after the fire, before the water came, after it took the old village. A slow, gentle change might pass without comment. A wall of water that takes your relatives, erases your harbour, and redraws your horizon in an afternoon is not easily forgotten. Cultural memory, like personal memory, is biased. It gives pride of place to the shocking, the extraordinary, the barely survivable. Those are the stories that get told most often, with the most intensity, at the most charged moments. Those are the ones that get woven into origin myths, taboos, rituals. Do not build too close to the shore, says the story, because once the sea climbed the hill. Do not sleep when the mountain speaks, says another, because once it blew apart the sky. Volcanoes in particular seem to burn themselves into narrative. In the Pacific Northwest of North America, the Klamath people tell of a great battle between spirits that shattered a high mountain and left a deep round hole. The mountain's fiery heart, they say, fell back into the earth. The story speaks of darkness at noon, of fire falling from the sky, of ash so thick it choked the rivers. Geologists looking at Mount Mazama, the collapsed volcano whose caldera now holds Crater Lake, see an eruption about 7,700 years ago that matches those descriptions eerily well. A massive explosion, pyroclastic flows, ash spread across half a continent. In Japan, in the Mediterranean, in Indonesia, similar pairing appear. Myths of sky-darkening dragons and angry gods that line up in time and place with known eruptions and earthquakes. Along tsunami-prone coasts, there are stories about waves that walked inland like a wall, about fish found in treetops, about boats left stranded miles from shore. In some indigenous communities around the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, such stories included specific behavioral instructions. If the sea suddenly pulls back, do not gather the exposed shellfish, run uphill. Those who kept and obeyed these memories sometimes survived later tsunamis, that others, less tied to older narratives, did not. None of this proves that any specific flood myth maps neatly onto a single datable event. The match is rarely that tidy. Time compresses. Different disasters blur into each other. Moral and cosmological meanings are layered onto raw descriptions, but it does suggest that when cultures all over the world talk about waters that rose higher than anyone expected, about coasts that vanished, about rivers that turned violent and strange, we should listen with more than a folklorist's curiosity. We may be hearing echoes, distorted, sanctified, poetically framed, of a real, unstable planet, a planet that, in the deep past of our species, repeatedly reminded scattered human groups just how thin the line is between habitable land and hungry sea. And once you admit that memory can stretch that far, and that myth can carry real events for thousands of years, a new set of questions opens up. If flood stories are not just allegories, but archives, what else are they doing? What are these waters in our stories actually washing away? And what are they making room for in the imagination when they recede? The inside of the human mind. Because even if every flood story on Earth began with a real shoreline vanishing, that still wouldn't explain why people chose to remember them the way they did. Why gods get angry. Why the world has to end in water before it can begin again. Why, in culture after culture, the flood is not just disaster, but reset. One of the people who thought hard about this was Carl Jung. Jung believed that beneath our individual memories and personal quirks, there is a deeper layer of the psyche, a shared reservoir of images and patterns he called the collective unconscious. In that reservoir, he argued, live archetypes, not specific characters like Noah or Utnapishtim, but structural ideas that keep recurring. The wise old man, the hero, the trickster, and the flood. For Jung, water itself is one of the most important symbols of the unconscious. It is fluid, formless, depth, without clear boundary. The conscious mind, with its plans and categories and daily routines, is like the thin land we live on at the edge of that ocean. Every so often, in dreams or in crises, the waters rise. Seen this way, a flood myth is not just about too much rain. It is about what happens when the unconscious overwhelms the fragile order of consciousness, when all the old certainties, the houses and fields of the mind, are swept away. In Jungian language, this is a psychic inundation, a breakdown of the existing ego structure, terrifying, but also potentially necessary, because after the flood, something new can be built. Notice how often the stories follow that rhythm. The world becomes corrupt, or rigid, or forgetful of its origins. The gods, or fate, or nature send water. Everything familiar is submerged. One small vessel of survival rides it out. An ark, a raft, a tree, a single person clinging to a floating log. When the waters recede, that survivor steps into a changed world, a new covenant, a new law, a new humanity. It looks psychologically like the pattern of breakdown and renewal that individuals experience during profound life transitions. The old identity drowned, a period of confusion and drift, then gradual emergence into a restructured life. Jung would say, of course, cultures tell this story. It's built into how minds reorganize themselves under pressure. Another thinker who approached flood myths from a different angle was Mircea Eliade, a historian of religions who was fascinated by how traditional societies experience time. Eliade noticed that many myths don't just explain why things are the way they are, they reenact the beginning of the world. He called this pattern the eternal return. By telling or ritually reliving a cosmogonic event, the creation of the cosmos out of chaos, people symbolically return to that original pure time. They renew reality. For Eliade, the flood is often not the end of the world, but a necessary prelude to its recreation. Water, in this reading, is the primordial stuff from which order first emerged. When the gods send a deluge, they are not simply punishing. They are dissolving a worn-out world back into the undifferentiated, washing away accumulated guilt, pollution, stagnation. The ark, or the mountain peak, or the lone survivor floating on a vast sea is like the tiny seed that carries the principle of form through that dissolution. When land reappears, the survivor repeats the acts of the first creation, naming things, sacrificing, planting, making laws. The cosmos is refounded. Ritually, some societies mirror this on a smaller scale. New Year festivals that involve sprinkling or immersing in water, cleansing rituals before major transitions, ceremonial baths for initiates, all echo the pattern of ending, submerging, and beginning again. Underneath the theology, the symbolic grammar is consistent. Water wipes the slate, then gives it back, blank. This double nature of water, destroyer and purifier, death and rebirth, is remarkably stable across cultures. In Hindu tradition, the Ganges can both kill with its floods and liberate the dead whose ashes are given to its current. In Christian rites, baptism is explicitly a kind of drowning. The old self symbolically dies under the water and a new self rises. In Islam, ritual washing before prayer both cleans the body and prepares the soul. In Shinto, misugi, the practice of standing under a waterfall or immersing in cold rivers, removes spiritual impurity. Even outside formal religion, People gravitate to water when they want to mark a change. Cold plunges after illness, washing hands after funerals. The impulse to shower at the end of a difficult day, as if rinsing off not just sweat and dust, but the psychic residue of what happened. Part of this may be rooted in biology. All of us began our individual lives floating in amniotic fluid. Our first environment was warm, dark water. Birth itself is, in one sense, a flood. The breaking of waters, the sudden expulsion from a protected sea into the strange dry air. It is not hard to see how, at a deep level, immersion in water could come to symbolize a return to that original, undifferentiated state, followed by a second birth. To go under is to go back. To come up is to come out again new. So the symbolism is rich, and it tends to fall into pairs: purity and danger, womb and grave, forgetting and remembering. Another tradition, structuralism, looks at myths less as expressions of inner feelings and more as ways of thinking with opposites. Claude Lévi-Strauss, the best-known structuralist anthropologist, argued that human minds are drawn to binary contrasts: nature/culture, raw/cooked, wild/domesticated, chaos/order. Myths, he suggested, help mediate these oppositions, find a way to think about the relation between them. In that light, a flood story is almost tailor-made. Water belongs to nature. It is wild, formless, moving. The built environment, houses, fields, cities, belongs to culture. It is fixed, shaped, controlled. When the flood comes, those domains collide. The boundary fails. Nature reclaims culture. But in the process, something interesting happens. The survivor who steps out after the flood often carries a new cultural rule book. Don't eat this animal. Don't mix these behaviors. Build your house this far from the river. Worship in this way. The story then doesn't just dramatize chaos. It offers a way to rebuild order with a clearer understanding of its limits. It is a mental technology for living on the edge between a predictable human world and the unpredictable environment that sustains and threatens it. Underneath Jung's archetypes, Eliade's cosmogonies, and Lévi-Strauss's structures, there is a simpler, more concrete observation that many scholars make. Most complex societies formed where water was close. Rivers, deltas, floodplains, coastal estuaries. These are the places where soils are rich, fish are plentiful, transport is easy, and irrigation is possible. Mesopotamia, the Nile, the Indus, the Yellow River, the Mississippi, the Yangtze. Civilizations bloom where water can be tamed just enough. But just enough is a delicate balance. The same river that brings fertile silt in a gentle annual rise can, in a bad year, climb far higher than expected and strip a valley bare. The same monsoon that feeds the crops can linger a little too long and turn fields into inland seas. The same ocean that offers shellfish and trade routes can, under the right conditions, step miles inland in the span of a single terrifying afternoon. You don't need Jung or Eliade to explain why people who live with that reality at their doorstep might fear it, revere it, and organize their stories around it. Floods are one of the few truly universal natural disasters. You might never see a volcanic eruption or a meteor strike. You will almost certainly, over enough generations, see water behave badly. From this angle, flood myths are simply what happen when a species that tells stories lives next to dynamic water long enough. The danger is shared. The basic narrative, a world of land interrupted by sudden hostile sea, is shared. Of course there are parallels, and yet, if we stop there, something feels missing, because the symbolic patterns are not random. The way the stories are built, their obsession with endings and beginnings, with moral judgment and purification, with the lone vessel of survival, keeps circling back to those deeper psychological and cosmological themes. At the same time, the geological and geomythological evidence we looked at earlier suggests that at least some of these narratives are not free-floating allegories. They are anchored, however loosely, to real coastlines that drowned, real river courses that jumped, real waves that rolled over villages. So we're left with a layered picture. On one layer there are events, floods, tsunamis, glacial lakes draining in catastrophic pulses, sea levels rising over centuries. On another there are memories of those events carried in oral traditions and ritual practices. On a third there are universal patterns in how human minds process fear, loss and change. Patterns that lend themselves to certain kinds of stories. The great flood myths of the world sit where those layers overlap. They are not just coded history, nor just dreams. They are history remembered through dreamlike symbols. They take the raw fact of living on an unstable planet and weave it into a larger meditation on guilt and grace, chaos and order, death and renewal. And once you see them that way, the question shifts again. If both the rocks and the stories are telling us that water has erased worlds before, what else might be hiding in that zone where geology, memory and imagination meet? And how far are some people willing to go in explaining that overlap, once the evidence runs out and the speculation begins? One answer is very far. Out beyond the cautious language of peer-reviewed papers, in that misty borderland where geology meets imagination, you start to hear different kinds of voices. Less, on the one hand, on the other, more. What if we've been wrong about everything? This is where the lost civilizations live. If you've watched any popular documentaries or late-night interviews about ancient mysteries, you've probably encountered one of the most influential of these storytellers, Graham Hancock. Hancock's basic proposal is simple enough to be catchy and bold enough to feel dangerous. He suggests that before the end of the last ice age, before Mesopotamia, before Egypt, long before Sumer wrote its flood tablets, there was an advanced global civilization, not with smartphones and satellites, but with levels of navigation, architecture and astronomy far beyond what orthodox history allows for that period. In his version, this civilization flourished during the Ice Age, when sea levels were more than 100 meters lower. Vast coastal plains, now drowned, held cities, temples, and knowledge that would later only survive as scraps and legends. Then, around 12,800 years ago, something terrible happened. A sudden climate catastrophe, huge floods, global fires, the end of the world seen from the perspective of those people. A few survivors, Hancock suggests, carried fragments of their lost wisdom to scattered places, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, perhaps the pyramids, perhaps enigmatic ruins in the Americas. And as their descendants struggled to rebuild, they wrap the memory of the disaster in stories. Stories about gods who drown wicked humanity, about golden ages destroyed in a night, about floods that wipe the slate so something new can begin. Atlantis in this picture is not just Plato's philosophical thought experiment. It's a memory, distorted, mythologized, but anchored in an actual Ice Age culture that died in water. Mainstream archaeologists do not buy this. The reasons are not mysterious or conspiratorial. There is so far no clear archaeological layer that shows a globally advanced civilization before known Neolithic cultures. No corresponding cities under the sea with datable artifacts. No unambiguous inscriptions bridging a pre-10,000 BCE culture to later societies. What we do see instead is a more gradual, regionally distinct rise of agriculture, architecture, and complex religion. Göbekli Tepe, for instance, is extraordinary, but it looks like the work of hunter-gatherers experimenting with monumentality, not the outpost of a vanished technocratic elite. And yet, the questions Hancock points at are not entirely baseless, because something very dramatic did happen around the time his story centres on. The climate lurched. This brings us to a different, more technical controversy. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. If you drill into Greenland's ice, you can read Earth's climate like tree rings. Around 12,800 years ago, those frozen layers record a sudden swing back into near-glacial conditions, just as the planet seemed to be warming out of the last ice age. Temperatures in parts of the northern hemisphere may have dropped rapidly. Ecosystems shifted. Many large animals, mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, were on their way out. For a long time, the cause of this Younger Dryas cold relapse was debated in relatively calm academic tones. Changes in ocean circulation, meltwater disrupting currents, subtle shifts in solar output. Then, in 2007, a team of researchers proposed something more cinematic. They suggested that fragments of a disintegrating comet, or possibly an asteroid, slammed into or exploded over the ice sheets and continents of the northern hemisphere. The impacts, they argued, would have showered the atmosphere with dust, soot and water vapor, triggering fires, blocking sunlight and destabilizing the climate. Meltwater pulses could have surged into the oceans, raising sea levels and causing outburst floods. In other words, a cosmic trigger for sudden cold, ecological chaos, and, perhaps, for some of those mega-floods that later became the skeletons of myth. At first, many geologists and paleoclimatologists were deeply skeptical. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and impact craters from that exact time were elusive. Some of the proposed markers, tiny spherules, unusual distributions of platinum, charcoal layers, could, critics argued, be explained by more ordinary processes. But the idea would not die. Over the years, new papers have trickled out, finding what some interpret as impact proxies at sites in North America, Europe and the Middle East. A thin layer enriched in platinum here, unusual forms of glassy melt there, timing that lines up suspiciously well with the onset of the Younger Dryas. The debate is ongoing. Many researchers remain unconvinced. Others consider a cosmic impact plausible, at least as part of a larger cascade of events. It is not settled science. It is an active, sometimes heated argument. What's notable, for our purposes, is that this is one of those fringe ideas that has, at least partly, pulled legitimate research along with it. Even critics of the impact hypothesis have had to sharpen their understanding of late Ice Age climate dynamics, megafloods and extinction patterns to respond. The conversation has expanded. If we rewind even further, we find another cosmic flood story proposed by scientists rather than mystics, the Tolman-Bolide hypothesis. In the early 1990s, Alexander and Edith Tolman, an Austrian geologist couple, argued that around 9600 BCE, a date they associated, interestingly, with Plato's Atlantis chronology, a giant comet broke apart and struck Earth in multiple places, not just one crater, but several, mostly in the oceans. They pointed to supposed impact structures, layers of unusual deposits, and, crucially, to global flood traditions. According to their reading, those myths, biblical, Mesopotamian, Indian, Native American, were cultural fossils of a single worldwide catastrophe. Gigantic tsunamis radiating out from oceanic impacts, smashing coastlines, drowning lowlands, terrifying anyone alive to witness them. The scientific community was, on the whole, harsher on this proposal than on the Younger Dryas impact. Many of the claimed craters have not stood up to scrutiny. The geological evidence is, at best, ambiguous, and the attempt to tie almost every major flood myth on Earth to one specific event at one specific time is exactly the kind of sweeping monocausal explanation that makes historians nervous. Cultures reuse themes. Similar stories can arise from similar local disasters without needing a single master catastrophe behind them, and yet The Tolman's work illustrates something important about how these theories operate. They don't just offer mechanisms, comets, fragments, bolides. They offer meaning. They say your stories are not just stories. They are eyewitness accounts, stretched and stylized across millennia. They anchor human memory to cosmic drama. They connect the small, frightened groups on riverbanks to vast objects falling from the sky. That is intoxicating. It also explains why ideas like Hancock's lost civilization or recurrent comet strikes gain so much traction with the public, even when specialists remain wary. First, they are narrative-rich. They have clear villains and victims, rises and falls, an advanced culture wiped out by nature, a golden age punished, survivors seeding new societies. This mirrors the flood myth template almost too perfectly. Second, they satisfy a deep intuition that there must have been more. That our species' story didn't just creep forward in small increments, but leapt and crashed, with forgotten chapters buried offshore or under ice. Third, they speak to a modern anxiety. If an earlier global civilization was blindsided by a cosmic rock or an abrupt climate shift, what does that say about us? Our satellites may be better, our computers faster, but we're still living on the same fragile crust under the same sky. From a historian's perspective, there is a balance to be struck here. On one side, open-mindedness. The Earth has, beyond any doubt, been struck by large objects from space before. Massive floods have happened. Sea levels have risen by more than 100 meters since the glacial maximum. Human populations have watched familiar coasts drown and rivers rearrange themselves. To simply declare, in advance, that no large sudden events can shape human history would be as dogmatic as assuming that every myth is literal reportage. On the other side, discipline. The fact that something is possible does not mean it happened in the way a theory describes. Evidence matters. Chronology matters. Independent lines of data, sediments, ice cores, artifacts, DNA, oral traditions have to converge, not just be forced into alignment because the story's appealing. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis shows what this middle path can look like. It started as a bold, marginally accepted proposal. Over time, some of its testable claims have found modest support, others have been challenged, and the model has evolved. Whatever the final verdict, the process has been scientific. Arguments, measurements, revisions. The more sweeping lost civilization narratives, in contrast, often move in the opposite direction. When evidence fails to appear where it should, the explanation shifts to conspiracies, hidden records, or ocean floors conveniently unreachable. At that point, we have left inquiry and entered speculation. For our flood paradox, the lesson is quiet but important. It is entirely possible that real cosmic events and catastrophic floods have threaded themselves into human memory. It is also possible that some of our most enduring myths preserve, in distorted form, genuine encounters with a wilder, more dangerous planet. But the power of those myths does not depend on a single comet, a single Atlantis, or a single bolide. They arise from something broader, the persistent tension between a storytelling animal, a volatile Earth, and a sky that occasionally throws stones. When we blur the line between what we can reasonably infer and what we simply wish were true, we risk losing sight of how remarkable the real story already is. So we stand in this strange place. On one shore, the careful reconstructions of geology and archaeology. On the other, the alluring silhouettes of lost continents and celestial disasters. Between them, the flood myths themselves, holding fragments of both. To move forward, we have to decide how to treat those fragments, as literal blueprints of erased civilizations, as pure metaphor, or as something more complicated, clues that only make sense when we weave together rocks, records, and the restless human need to turn fear into narrative. If we do that, another pattern begins to emerge, one that ties Sumerian tablets, biblical arcs, Himalayan floods, and even speculative comets into a single, if tentative, picture. A picture that tells us less about water or fire from the sky, and more about what it means to be a species that remembers drowning and keeps telling itself why. So what do we do with that picture? On one side, cautious layers of sediment and ice. On the other, sweeping tales of gods, arcs, and worlds washed clean. The temptation is to choose, to say, it was all just stories, or it was all one great event. But when you lay everything we've seen side by side, a different answer emerges. Not a single key that unlocks every door, but a ring of keys overlapping, sometimes jangling against each other. Part of the flood paradox dissolves the moment we stop hunting for the flood. Instead, imagine a world full of floods. Not in the abstract, but in the way your ancestors would have known them. Rivers that suddenly rose 10 meters in a night. Glacial lakes held in by ice dams, failing in hours and ripping valleys apart. Coastlines that, over a few generations, crept inland by kilometers as the last ice age thawed and the seas quietly climbed. Every region had its own catastrophes. In Mesopotamia it was the rivers, Tigris and Euphrates jumping their banks, cutting new channels, drowning fields that had fed families for centuries. In South Asia it was monsoon rivers turning from lifelines to avalanches of brown water. In China, the Yellow River, notorious even in recorded history for changing course and erasing towns. In the Pacific, typhoons and tsunamis rolling over atolls barely higher than a standing person. Along prehistoric shorelines, it was the slow but relentless invasion of the sea, swallowing marshes, forests, and the low plains where people first learned to farm. Each of these events was real, local, devastating. Different cultures remember different disasters. The Black Sea filling, a valley in the Himalayas sealed by a landslide lake that suddenly burst, a tsunami barreling into a Pacific island, a storm surge sweeping across a delta where a new city had just begun to rise. But human minds scattered across the planet kept reaching for the same shape to wrap these memories in. Water coming from above and below, the sky opening, the fountains of the deep breaking, the land disappearing, a few survivors, a boat, a raft, a high mountain, a tree. Animals carried, saved, or recreated. Old society swept away because it had become corrupt, or careless, or simply unlucky. A restart, a covenant, a warning. Over time, these many small histories told and retold rubbed against each other. Traders met at port towns and river crossings, swapping not just goods but stories. Conquerors carried their gods with them. Priests argued, edited, harmonized. A Babylonian deluge could seep into Hebrew scripture. An older Sumerian hero could be reborn as Utnapishtim, then echoed again in Noah. What you get from that process is not a single eyewitness account of a single event. You get an archetype taking shape, a multiple floods model, dozens, maybe hundreds, of separate memories of catastrophe, each anchored in a particular river or coast, converging over millennia into a common pattern. There was a time when the waters rose and almost everything was lost. Seen this way, the paradox softens. It is less mysterious that cultures separated by oceans tell similar stories if they are all living versions of the same basic equation: humans plus water plus time. Because if there is one thing the flood myths remind us of, it is where we have always chosen to live. Right on the edge, Nile floodplain, Mesopotamian alluvium, Indus Valley, Yellow River Basin, Tigris-Euphrates, Mississippi, Ganges-Brahmaputra, coasts fringed with mangroves and coral reefs. We are a rivers and shores species. Water feeds crops, carries boats, moderate temperature. It is the highway, the pantry, the original power source. The first towns almost everywhere cluster along river bends and estuaries. The first cities rise where silt and fresh water collaborate. But that bargain comes with a clause. The same river that brings life can rise a little too high. The same ocean that fills your nets can climb a little too far onto your beach. The same fertile delta that lets your people multiply can suddenly remind you that it was built by floods in the first place. Flood myths are, in that sense, settlement maps written in story form. They tell us that from the beginning we have lived in zones of risk. We traded security for abundance, and we knew it, even if we couldn't model the probabilities. So we made philosophy out of it. Because there is another layer beneath the geology and the archaeology, the human need to understand why. Why this family survived when the one downstream did not. Why the waters kept rising after everyone had already prayed. Why the old people said the river used to be lower, calmer, more predictable, and now it wasn't. When you don't have hydrological models, you have narrative. Sometimes that narrative is moral. The world drowned because people had become violent, or impious, or unjust. The flood is punishment, a stern reset ordered by gods tired of listening to humanity's noise. Sometimes it is almost random. The gods were fighting or playing or bored, a celestial miscommunication. The flood is an accident, and humans are collateral damage clinging to driftwood. Sometimes it is a test. The waters come, and the worthy, clever, obedient, lucky are warned in time, given instructions. Build a boat, hide in a jar, climb this mountain before the seventh rain. At their core, these stories are early attempts to reason with chaos. If disaster is punishment, maybe you can avoid it next time by behaving differently. If it's a test, maybe you can pass it by listening more carefully, preparing earlier, storing grain, learning to read the sky. If it's random, maybe you can at least accept that survival is partly grace, partly chance, partly stubbornness. Whatever the theology, the flood is never just water. It is the problem of suffering poured over a landscape. And that is where the myths begin to feel uncomfortably contemporary. Because while we sit here, in a time that thinks of itself as rational and technological, the waters are rising again. Not in a single night, not to the tops of mountains, but steadily, measurably. Glaciers retreat, ice sheets thin, thermal expansion nudges the ocean higher, storm surges ride that extra height a little farther inland. Cities built on deltas and coasts, where the food was, where the trade was, watch king tides lap at sea walls that were supposed to hold for another century. In island nations across the Pacific, in low-lying parts of Bangladesh, in the bayous of Louisiana, people are already living the opening chapters of new flood stories. Houses lifted on stilts, cemeteries flooding, salt water creeping into wells, quiet conversations about when relocation stops being unthinkable and becomes inevitable. When you read those ancient myths with this in mind, they stop being distant fantasies and start sounding like letters from the past to the future.